Hello YouTube, and welcome to my channel. My name is Benedict the 17th, and today I'm going to respond to some of the questions raised by the Anarchist community on YouTube. The 9 questions I am responding to are divided into 3 categories: individualism versus collectivism, questions of rights, and efficiency of government. The link to the video from which the questions were selected is below, as are the channels of the contributors to that video. They include Atomic ANCAP, Esoteric Entity, Mike the Cat, and Sir Conservatarian. I want to thank these contributors for their well thought out questions and look forward to hearing their thoughts to my responses. I will also post some questions for them at the end of my video. So let's get started. Section 1. Individualism versus collectivism. Question 1. When you liberalists support openly collectivist policies such as universal healthcare, interventionist foreign policies, or even just the notion of a state, which is a collective, how can you call yourselves individuals? When we talk about individuals in the context of individualism, we have to understand that what we are talking about are individual persons. So in order to talk about individualism, we need to understand what a person is. I would define a person as a being in community with the capacity for relationship. Human beings are awesome creatures, not just because we can respond to, interact with, and even change our environment, but because we can do these things to and with other human beings. In fact, not only can we, but we naturally tend towards doing so and desire complex social structures to do it in. One of those social structures is the state. So not only is it not contradictory to support states and other political units and call ourselves individualists, it is in fact necessary for the good of individuals that we have a state. In fact, the Greek philosopher Aristotle called man the political animal, and argued that man's participation in the social and political life of the state is the highest good. Now, the reason why man is more of a political animal than bees or any other gregarious animals is evident. Nature, as we often say, makes nothing in vain, and man is the only animal whom she has endowed with the gift of speech. And whereas mere sound is but an indication of pleasure or pain, and is therefore found in other animals, for their nature attains to the perception of pleasure and pain and the intimation of them to one another, and no further, the power of speech is intended to set forth the expedient and inexpedient, and likewise the just and the unjust. And it is a characteristic of man that he alone has any sense of good and evil, of just and unjust, and the association of living beings who have this sense makes a family and a state. From Aristotle's Politics. Question 2. Isn't the liberalist definition of individualism the textbook definition of utilitarianism? No. The textbook definition of utilitarianism is the good or moral act to take is that which maximizes utility, that is the greatest amount of pleasure with the least amount of pain for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism, developed by Jeremy Bentham and refined by John Stuart Mill, is a version of consequentialist ethics that chooses not to take into account normative and metanormative principles. As a liberalist, I believe in individual rights as metanormative principles that ground the political order in the moral order, and are derived from metaphysical inquiry into the nature of a human being, not from utility. I would therefore not be a utilitarian, nor would anyone who accepts individual rights as normative principles, which all liberalists do. Question 3. Why is the state allowed to do things individuals are not? At the end of the video, the Atomic ANCAP posted a quote from Lysander Spooner, essentially saying that a state, which is a collection of men, cannot acquire any rights which they did not have individually. It is from this premise that the question, why is the state allowed to do things individuals are not, comes from. Obviously, if Lysander Spooner is right and a state is merely a collection of individuals, then the state should not be allowed to do things individuals can't. However, Lysander Spooner makes a philosophical error called the fallacy of composition, which is assuming that what is true of a member of a group is true of the group as a whole. A great example of this is that cats are made up of atoms. Atoms are non-living. Therefore, it would seem that cats must be non-living since every part of the cat is made up of non-living things. This would of course be false. Life is a property that emerges from the relationship between non-living things. Similarly, a state, though wholly made up of human beings, is different from human beings because of properties that emerge through the relationship of individual human beings within it. That is why the state is allowed to do things individuals are not. As Aristotle once said, the whole is not then a mere heap, but something greater than its parts. Aristotle, Metaphysics, Book 8. Section 2. Questions of rights. Question 4. Rights are either objective and then collectivist organizations such as the state violate rights, or if the state doesn't violate rights, then we must believe rights don't exist. How do you justify calling yourselves liberalists then? I think this question presents a false dichotomy. In fact, I can quite easily say that rights are objective and that the state doesn't necessarily violate rights. In fact, a well-functioning state often supports the expression of human rights and allows for greater human flourishing. That's why humans have a tendency of making states. Question 5. Where do you get the notion that the largest violator of rights on the planet protects our rights? It is a bit unclear what is meant by the phrase the largest violator of rights. Presumably, what is meant is the state as some kind of amorphous concept. But that doesn't make sense because there are a variety of different states and governments, and grouping them together for this question doesn't work. Some states cause lots of human rights violations, others, very few, if any at all. However, I think it's fair to say that within the territory of any one country, the government of that country most likely has the greatest capacity to violate rights. But this is not without exception. Large corporations and countries with ineffective governments are a close runner-up. And this is revelatory of a mistaken assumption in the question. The question seems to suggest that a government is something apart from its role, that is, a collection of men who define and enforce the laws of a nation. As soon as those men cease to have that role, they are no longer a government. It's not that a government is an entity with a worse track record of human rights violations, it's that whoever has the role of defining and enforcing the laws of a nation has greater capacity than others to violate human rights. Now the anarchist answer is to say that no one should define and enforce the laws of a nation. People should be responsible for protecting their own rights. But that wouldn't fix anything, because then while the capacity of any one given individual to violate rights might have gone down, the likelihood of all the other individuals to actually violate rights has gone up. Think about it this way. Bars employ bouncers to help prevent bar fights from breaking out and having customers beaten to a bloody pulp by other customers. Now, because they need to be able to stop fights, bouncers need to have the physical capacity necessary to beat someone up. Therefore, the bouncer of the bar is typically the single person with the greatest capacity to beat people up in any given bar. Yet, less people get beaten up at bars with bouncers than at bars without bouncers, despite the greater capacity for it in bars with bouncers. Why is that? Because when there is an understanding in a bar that there is someone responsible to beat up anyone else if they try to beat up a third party, fewer people try to beat up other people. The government is the bouncer of human society. It's not there to spoil our fun, it's just there to tell us when we've had one too many and it's time to go home. Question 6. At what point is taxation not theft? Given that I'm talking to anarchists, I'm assuming that the real question being asked is, why isn't taxation theft at all? The answer is simple. Taxes are what you agreed to pay when you decided you wanted to participate in human society. Now you might say, but I didn't agree to participate in human society. To which the answer is, human beings, as was stated above, are social animals, and so their telos, or natural end, is participation in human society. Therefore, it would be irrational to choose not to participate in human society. Therefore, the assumption is that you want to participate in human society because we assume you are rational. If you don't want to participate in human society, that's fine. But then the assumption we have to make is that you are irrational, and people who lack rationality, like children, the very elderly, or people with mental health issues, can't be trusted to know what is good for themselves. Therefore, Society has a responsibility for their welfare in a more expansive sense than for a typical individual. And society has decided what is good for you, which is what you pay for out of your taxes. So either you are rational and you pay taxes because you know that it's good for you, or you aren't rational and then society helps you pay your taxes because you don't know what's good for you. This may sound patronizing, but think about it. Why do you pay taxes? If you're a really good person, you might say because you know that's the right thing to do, or it's what's best for society. If you're like me, and not quite so saintly, you might say because you don't want to go to jail. And why don't you want to go to jail? Ultimately, it's because you don't want the social disapproval of someone who doesn't follow the rules of society. Section 3. Efficiency of government. Question 7. Why are skeptics not skeptical of the state's ability to protect rights? I am skeptical of the state's ability to protect rights. I'm just equally skeptical of other mechanisms used to protect rights. Just because I don't trust the government doesn't mean I trust the things that would pop up in its absence. Question 8. What do you have against the privatization of roads? The distinction between ownership and use. If the roads would be owned by the people that use the roads, I'd be all for it, because that would mean that the people who use the roads would have the greater ability to adjust the roads to the needs of the local community. Unfortunately, that's typically not what is meant by private ownership. Rather, it would be the shareholders of McDonald's, Comcast, or Facebook deciding when and how to repair roads because they are the ones who'd be able to afford to buy roads from the government. And I don't trust the shareholders at any conglomerate to know the needs of the people on Cherry Hill Street. Question 9. Where do you get the notion that a mob that is elected legally will protect you against a mob that is not elected legally? Because we'd hang them if they didn't. That's one of the great advantages of a government over a corporatocracy. It's easier to hang a government than a group of shareholders. Thank you for listening. I hope I've answered these questions sufficiently. If any of you listening have your own answers or critiques of mine, please leave a comment. Now I've got a few questions for the Anarchist Collective. Question 1. If human beings could exist apart from the state, then why is it that every human society has always existed in a state, and those that haven't tend to fare poorly? Question 2. Corporations are legal fictions that allow shareholders to limit their liability and risk over a company. This is what renders them distinct from partnerships and sole proprietors. If we were to get rid of the state, would you be willing to also get rid of corporations and only have partnerships or sole proprietors? Question 3. Do you believe that all contractual agreements are binding no matter the circumstances? For example, suppose Mary Sue and Bobby Joe were walking along a river. Mary Sue falls in and begins to drown. Bobby Joe says that he will only rescue Mary Sue if she agrees to sleep with him. If Mary Sue agrees, is she contractually obligated to comply? If she doesn't, is it a violation of the non-aggression principle? If not, why? Finally, question 4. Why are there so many furries in the ANCAP community? I look forward to hearing your responses. Go with God.